University City was the Jewish neighborhood of St. Louis. It's where both of my parents were born, and it's where just about every Jew of a certain age who's come out of St. Louis grew up. I say of a certain age because, like many Jewish neighborhoods during the 60s, as African Americans started moving in, the Jews started moving out. It's the story of most of my friends' grandparents, and the story of my dad's parents. Like my dad's parents, my mom's parents were ready for a bigger place in 1968. But unlike my dad's parents, they chose to buy a larger house there in University City. They didn't realize it at the time, but in 1968, they were the only white family in St. Louis to buy a house in University City. Literally, the only white family. They didn't do it as a political statement, and I imagine when my mom tells my grandpa about it, he'll be a little embarrassed that I mentioned it. But it's a lived value of his that I treasure. It's my true inheritance. It's my true yichus. And as much as I spend my time angry and frustrated at our lack of progress as a nation and as humanity, I look to my grandfather, to his generation, and can only be grateful at the world that they fought to give us. This week's parashah, Parshat Yitro, begins with a long section of narrative devoted to the relationship between Moshe Rabbeinu and his father-in-law, Yitro. The narrative begins with Yitro returning with Moses' wife, Tzipporah, his daughter, and their two children who've been staying with Yitro during the turmoil of the plagues and of the exodus from Egypt. Moshe tells Yitro of what God did for us in Egypt, and Yitro praises God and offers a sacrifice. Now, the Mechilta has an odd tradition about Yitro. According to this midrash, when Moshe Rabbeinu first went to Yitro to ask for Tzipporah's hand in marriage, he was told yes, on one condition, that his firstborn be raised with avodah zarah, that his firstborn be an idol worshiper. All of Moses' future children can be servants of the God of Israel, but the firstborn must be an idolater. Perhaps more surprising than the request is the fact that Moses agrees pretty quickly. As you can imagine, commentators throughout the centuries have struggled with this. First, there's the problem of Moses, who agrees to this bizarre request in the first place. Perhaps more troubling, though, is Yitro, who, according to Rashi, by this point had already accepted that there are no gods but God, and in fact had already circumcised himself in a conversion to Judaism. That Yitro wants his own grandson to be raised as an idolater. Rabbi Shimon Schwab, one of the early German proponents of Torah im derech eretz, of modern Orthodoxy as we know it today, offers an explanation. According to Rabbi Schwab, Yitro is not making a religious argument, but instead a pedagogical one. Yitro himself, according to tradition, had tried worshiping all the idols in the world, and only once he realized the futility of such worship on his own did he begin to accept HaKodesh Baruch Hu into his heart and become a part of the Jewish people. It's the same lesson that he wants his grandson to experience. I'm not sure why they never contemplate the idea that it could be a granddaughter, but to find the truth of the God of his ancestors, of Abraham and of Sarah, on his own. Moses, as might be expected, would prefer that his kids be raised Jewish, and so they compromise, with only the first taught avodah zarah, and all of those who come after raised to worship Hashem. This is a story that speaks to the idea of self-discovery in tension with revealed wisdom. But it's also a midrash that speaks to the wisdom of the past and its relevance to our future. The story of Moshe Rabbeinu and Yitro does not end with the return of Moses' family. Instead, this is just the beginning, the precursor to the lesson that Moses learns from his father-in-law. In the second aliyah of this parsha, chapter 18, verse 13, if you're keeping track, begins with Moses overworked and exhausted. We've just begun our travels in the wilderness, and tradition tells us that Moses is the only judge for 600,000 men. So Yitro approaches his son-in-law, and he tells him that he's working himself to death, that for his own good and for the good of the Jewish people, he must appoint judges to administer justice. Such a simple idea, but one that resonates through our history and to the core of what it means to be a Jew. When we are at our best, we are a people who advocate for justice throughout the world. So important is this idea that it's one of our Noahide laws. It's one of these 7 laws that apply not just to Jews, but to Gentiles, that they must set up courts of justice. But beyond just the obvious lesson, that of the importance of justice, there's a second lesson as well. This is the lesson of generations, of listening and learning from those who came before us, and whose actions and good deeds led to us, those who made the world just perfect enough for us to continue their work. There's a family tradition on my father's side of the family that we're descended from the great Ari, from Yitzhak Luria. So with that in mind, I don't feel bad at all continuing with the great Reform tradition of reinterpreting his Lurianic myth. In the Lurianic myth, God had to contract God's self in order to make room for creation. So the very essence of divine was poured into vessels of creation. However, these vessels were not strong enough to contain the holiness that was within them, and so they shattered and spread throughout the world. It's our job then, it's our very purpose as humanity, it's why we are here, to find those broken shards and redeem the sparks of holiness within them. Whether that redemption is done through the observance of mitzvot, as traditional Judaism teaches, or through acts of righteousness in this world, as our movement has interpreted it. It is our mission statement as a people and as humanity. We are here to be co-creators with God, to redeem the imperfections and to strive towards a more perfect world. I say more perfect in a uniquely spin on the idea, a uniquely Reform spin on the idea. Following in the teachings of the great Reform philosophers Herman Cohen and Stephen Schwarzschild, I was listening in class. I don't believe that we can ever achieve perfection, that we can ever reach a messianic age where all of the broken shards have been redeemed. But we must keep striving, we must keep working. It's the lesson of Yitro, and it's the lesson of my grandfather, and it is our obligation to the future. Even as Moshe Rabbeinu must have been deeply grateful to Yitro for his advice, for his wisdom, for the world which he was passing on to Moses, I'm grateful to my grandfather. In August of 2004, Missouri put a gay marriage ban up for vote. It passed in Missouri, not surprisingly, with 76% of the voters choosing to put discrimination and bigotry into the Missouri Constitution. A few days later, I was over at Grandpa's for a Shabbos dinner, and we were talking about the recent election. I decided to ask Grandpa how he'd voted, though I imagine that I already knew, seeing as his demographic voted almost unanimously in favor of the ban. He was, after all, 83 years old then. I made him repeat himself because I didn't trust my ears when he answered. "Danny," he said, in words that still ring through my ears, "bigotry is bigotry no matter who it is against. If I haven't made the world better for you, then what was the point?" We live with the pressures of the past, of how hard they've pushed and how far we've come. Our ancestors spoke the truth of Torah and of justice in a world that had seen neither. They pushed back the darkness of slavery, and they defeated the Nazis. They marched with King at Selma, and they cried for Matthew Shepard. They fought Amalek at every turn and at every time. It can be overwhelming to see how much these generations have accomplished, how much is left yet to be done. But like Moshe Rabbeinu learning not just what to do from Yitro, but also how to do it, we stand on solid shoulders and soldier on in pursuit of an ancient dream of a more perfect world. So though we continue to fight, and we must continue to fight, for there's so much brokenness waiting to be redeemed, I want to pause for a moment in gratitude. To Yitro for the wisdom he imparted to Moses for giving us a model of how to learn from the past, to the Jews of thousands of years who studied in dark halls and in hushed tones so that we could inherit their wisdom here at HUC, to the Jews who emerged out of the Shoah, out of the darkest corner of Jewish history, and fought so that we could be the first generation of Jews in 2,000 years to take for granted that we can be a free people in our own land. And to my Grandpa Gene, for all that he has done and continues to do, for me and for my world, grasping the best that is life every day and teaching me with every breath that he takes to grow old, but to continue to live. For the paradigm he has lived for me, a paradigm that says our yet-to-be-redeemed world can be better, and that it is our obligation to make sure that it will be. Boker Tov. We rise as we turn to page 586 for Aleinu. Aleinu v'shabeach